January 20th, 2025. Donald J. Trump has officially returned to the Oval Office, sworn in as the 47th President of the United States. But within just hours of reclaiming the presidency, he began signing executive orders that sent shockwaves across the nation and the globe. This isn't just another presidential transition. What we witnessed on Trump's first day back represents one of the most dramatic and comprehensive policy reversals in modern American history. From immigration to climate policy, from federal bureaucracy to international relations, everything changed in a matter of hours. In this video, we break down what Trump has already done on day one, analyze the immediate consequences of each decision, explore how his first moves are reshaping American policy, and examine what it signals for the months and years to come. These are no longer predictions or campaign promises. These are the real actions taken by President Trump on his first day back in power. And the ripple effects are already being felt from Washington, D.C. to every corner of America. At noon on January 20th, Trump took the oath of office on the steps of the Capitol, surrounded by cheering supporters, tense political observers, and a sea of cameras capturing every moment. The ceremony itself was traditional, but what followed was anything but. Unlike previous presidents who typically spend their first day in office meeting with staff, reviewing briefings, and gradually settling into the role, Trump had a different plan. His transition team had spent months preparing what they internally called the shock and awe strategy, a coordinated assault on the previous administration's policies. By 2 p.m., just 2 hours after taking the oath, Trump was already in the Oval Office signing his first executive order. By 6 p.m., over a dozen major policy directives had been signed, sealed, and delivered to federal agencies across the government. These weren't symbolic gestures or minor adjustments. These were sweeping reversals of Biden-era policies, comprehensive administrative directives that touched every major department, and internal memos that began the immediate transformation of how the federal government operates. Though the inaugural ceremony was peaceful and followed constitutional protocol, the political transition has been anything but smooth. Within hours, federal agencies were in chaos, media outlets were scrambling to cover the rapid-fire announcements, and advocacy groups on both sides were mobilizing for what's already being called the Great Reversal. The most dramatic day one in presidential history. Section 2. The Immigration Crackdown. Immigration was Trump's first target, and the changes were immediate and comprehensive. This wasn't just about border security, it was a complete overhaul of America's immigration system. At 2:15 p.m., Trump signed the Border Security Emergency Act, which accomplished several things simultaneously. First, it reinstated the Remain in Mexico policy, officially known as the Migrant Protection Protocols. This means asylum seekers must now wait in Mexico while their cases are processed, reversing Biden's policy that allowed them to wait in the United States. Thousands of pending cases are now being transferred. Second, the order accelerated construction of the border wall by declaring a national emergency and redirecting military construction funds, the same controversial funding mechanism he used in his first term. Construction crews are already being mobilized to resume work on previously halted sections. Third, it authorized ICE to resume mass deportation operations with expanded authority. The new directive removes many of the restrictions placed on ICE during the Biden administration, allowing them to conduct raids in sensitive locations like schools and hospitals, something that was previously prohibited. Fourth, he deployed 5,000 National Guard troops to the southern border, the largest military deployment to the border in decades. These troops have been granted unprecedented authority to assist in immigration enforcement. But perhaps most controversially, Trump invoked emergency powers under the National Emergencies Act to bypass congressional oversight. This allows his administration to implement these changes immediately without waiting for legislative approval, a move that has constitutional lawyers on both sides preparing for major court battles. The response was immediate. Within hours, California, New York, and 8 other states filed emergency injunctions. Pro-immigration groups began mobilizing legal challenges, while Border Patrol agents reported a surge in apprehensions as migrants rushed to cross before the new policies took full effect. For millions of Americans, immigration has once again become the nation's most divisive political battleground. Number 3. Dismantling the deep state. At 3:30 p.m., Trump signed what many consider his most controversial executive order, the return of Schedule F. But this time, it was bigger and more comprehensive than ever before. Schedule F is a classification system that removes job protections from federal employees deemed to be in policy-making positions. During his first term, Trump created this system in his final months, but Biden quickly reversed it. Now it's back with expanded scope. The new Schedule F doesn't just target a few thousand employees, it potentially affects tens of thousands of federal workers across every major department: the Department of Justice, Internal Revenue Service, Environmental Protection Agency, Centers for Disease Control, Department of Education, and even the Pentagon are all included. By 5 p.m., reports began surfacing of immediate terminations. Senior officials at the DOJ who had overseen investigations into Trump were reportedly escorted from their offices. EPA scientists who had worked on climate change research received termination notices. IRS officials who had been involved in tax enforcement against wealthy individuals found their access badges deactivated. But this goes beyond individual firings. Trump's team had prepared detailed lists of replacements. Many of them former campaign workers, conservative activists, and business executives who had been vetted for their loyalty to Trump's agenda. The goal isn't just to remove disloyal employees, but to fundamentally transform how the federal government operates. Supporters argue this is long overdue accountability, claiming that career federal employees had been undermining Trump's first-term agenda from within. They see it as returning power to elected officials and making the bureaucracy more responsive to voters' will. Critics, however, describe it as an authoritarian purge that threatens the independence and expertise of the federal workforce. They argue that career civil servants provide continuity and expertise that transcends political parties, and that removing them based on political loyalty rather than competence will cripple government effectiveness. Either way, the federal bureaucracy is being shaken to its core. Government unions are preparing massive lawsuits, while Trump's allies are celebrating what they call the beginning of the end of the administrative deep state. Number 4. Climate rollbacks. Environmental policy saw some of the most sweeping changes of day one, as Trump fulfilled multiple campaign promises with a series of executive orders signed between 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. US. The climate policy reversal package included 6 major components. First, Trump immediately withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, again. But this time, his administration also withdrew from several smaller international climate accords that Biden had joined, including the Global Methane Pledge and the Coalition for Climate Ambition. Second, he suspended all EPA regulations on carbon emissions that had been implemented since 2021. This includes vehicle emission standards, power plant regulations, and methane leak detection requirements. The EPA estimated these rollbacks could increase carbon emissions by 15% within 2 years. Third, the order opened millions of acres of federal land to oil and gas drilling, including areas that had been protected under Biden. The Bureau of Land Management was directed to fast-track pending lease applications and begin accepting new ones immediately. Fourth, all federal subsidies and tax credits for electric vehicles were eliminated. This includes the $7,500 consumer tax credit and billions in funding for EV charging infrastructure. Several major automakers saw their stock prices fluctuate wildly in after-hours trading. Fifth, the Inflation Reduction Act's climate provisions were suspended pending a comprehensive review, which many interpret as preparation for permanent elimination. This affects hundreds of billions in clean energy investments. Sixth, Trump reinstated oil drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, overturning Biden's prohibition on development in the sensitive ecosystem. The market reaction was immediate and dramatic. Oil and gas stocks surged, with some companies seeing double-digit gains in after-hours trading. Coal mining stocks also jumped. However, renewable energy companies plummeted, with solar and wind companies losing billions in market value. Environmental groups were equally swift in their response. The Sierra Club, Greenpeace, and dozens of other organizations filed emergency lawsuits before the sun set on Inauguration Day. Several blue states announced they would ignore federal rollbacks and maintain their own strict environmental standards. Internationally, the reaction was one of shock and disappointment. European leaders expressed concern about America's commitment to climate goals, while oil-producing nations celebrated the shift toward fossil fuel-friendly policies. Number 5. Law and order. Executive orders. Public safety and criminal justice saw a dramatic shift in federal priorities as Trump signed the Restoring Law and Order package at 5:30 p.m. The first component directed the Department of Justice to conduct comprehensive reviews of prosecutors in major cities who have implemented progressive criminal justice reforms. This specifically targets district attorneys in cities like San Francisco, Philadelphia, Chicago, and New York, who have reduced prosecutions for certain crimes or implemented alternative sentencing programs. But this wasn't just about review, it was about action. The DOJ was given authority to withhold federal funding from jurisdictions that don't meet new public safety standards. This could mean millions of dollars in federal grants being pulled from cities that don't change their prosecution policies. The second major change expanded qualified immunity protections for police officers. The order directs federal courts to apply the broadest possible interpretation of qualified immunity, making it much more difficult for citizens to sue police officers for alleged misconduct. Third, the administration issued new definitions of domestic extremism that shift focus from right-wing militia groups to left-wing activists. Environmental protesters, social justice organizers, and even some labor union activities could now be classified as domestic extremist activities under certain circumstances. Fourth, federal agencies were directed to prioritize investigations into what the order calls anti-American activities on college campuses. This includes protests against Israeli policy, certain Black Lives Matter activities, and environmental activism that disrupts business operations. The order also established new joint task forces between federal agencies and local police departments in major cities. These task forces have broad authority to investigate and prosecute crimes that cross state lines, effectively allowing federal involvement in local law enforcement in unprecedented ways. The response from law enforcement was mixed. While police unions generally praised the increased protections and support, some police chiefs expressed concern about federal overreach in local law enforcement matters. Civil liberties advocates were alarmed. The American Civil Liberties Union called it the most serious threat to constitutional rights in decades, while organizations like the NAACP announced plans for immediate legal challenges. Democratic governors and mayors condemned the orders, with some announcing they would refuse to cooperate with the new federal task forces. Republican officials, however, praised the return to common-sense law enforcement policies. Number 6. Reversing Biden's social policies. The culture war took center stage in the final hour of Trump's first day, as he signed a series of executive orders that rolled back Biden-era social policies and ignited immediate controversy across the nation. At 6 p.m., Trump signed the Protecting Women and Girls in Sports Act, which reversed Biden's Title IX guidance that had protected transgender students. The new policy requires schools to define sex based on biological sex at birth for the purposes of sports, bathrooms, and locker rooms. This means transgender students nationwide will be prohibited from using facilities or participating in sports that align with their gender identity. Schools that don't comply risk losing federal funding, a threat that affects virtually every public school and most private schools in America. The second order banned critical race theory and what it termed divisive concepts from all federal education programs, federal employee training, and institutions that receive federal funding. This includes not just explicit CRT instruction, but also discussions of systemic racism, white privilege, and unconscious bias. The ban extends to military training, federal contractor diversity programs, and even medical schools that receive federal research funding. Any institution that wants to maintain federal funding must certify that their programs don't include these divisive concepts. The third major change eliminated diversity, equity, and inclusion requirements and funding across the federal government. All DEI offices and federal agencies were ordered to close within 30 days, and their staff reassigned or terminated. Fourth, the military was directed to reinstate the ban on open transgender service members. Current transgender service members were given 90 days to either leave the military or serve according to their biological sex. New recruitment of transgender individuals was immediately suspended. Fifth, federal agencies were ordered to recognize only male and female as legal sex categories on all federal documents, including passports, social security records, and federal employment forms. This effectively eliminates the X gender marker that had been available on federal documents. The backlash was immediate and intense. Within hours, protests erupted on college campuses across the country. LGBTQ+ advocacy groups announced coordinated legal challenges, while progressive organizations called for massive demonstrations. Blue state governors quickly announced they would ignore federal guidance and maintain their own protections for LGBTQ+ students and workers. California's governor called an emergency legislative session to pass state-level protections. Conservative commentators and religious organizations, however, celebrated what they called a return to traditional American values and biological reality. Several red state governors announced they would fully implement the federal guidance and go even further with their own restrictions. The impact on education was immediate. School districts across the country held emergency meetings to determine how to implement the new requirements, while college administrators scrambled to understand how the changes would affect their federal funding. Number 7. Foreign policy shockwaves. As the sun began to set on January 20th, Trump's attention turned to foreign policy, and the changes he implemented sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles around the world. At 6:30 p.m., Trump signed the America First Foreign Policy Reset, which immediately froze all U.S. military and financial aid to Ukraine, pending what the administration called a comprehensive audit of effectiveness and American interests. This means the $60 billion aid package approved by Congress in 2024 was suspended, weapons shipments were halted, and intelligence sharing was reduced. Ukrainian President Zelensky called an emergency meeting with European allies, while Russian officials celebrated what they called a return to realism in American foreign policy. The order also delivered an ultimatum to NATO allies: increase defense spending to 3% of GDP within 12 months or face reduced American commitment to the alliance. This goes beyond the current 2% target and would require massive military spending increases by most European nations. Several NATO allies immediately called emergency meetings. The requirement would force countries like Germany to nearly double their defense spending, while smaller nations would face impossible budget constraints. European leaders expressed shock at the aggressive timeline and threatened consequences. On China, Trump suspended several Biden-era diplomatic initiatives while maintaining existing tariffs and trade restrictions. However, he also announced plans for direct leader-to-leader diplomacy, with President Xi Jinping suggesting a return to the personal diplomacy approach of his first term. Perhaps most controversially, Trump authorized his Secretary of State to reach out to Russian officials about resuming diplomatic talks on Ukraine, arms control, and sanctions relief. This represents a dramatic shift from the Biden administration's policy of minimal engagement with Russia. In the Middle East, Trump reinstated the maximum pressure campaign against Iran, reimposing sanctions that had been lifted during Biden's attempted diplomatic outreach. He also suspended U.S. participation in indirect nuclear negotiations. On Israel-Palestine, Trump reversed Biden's criticism of Israeli settlement expansion and announced that the U.S. would no longer oppose Israeli sovereignty over disputed territories. Palestinian officials called it a declaration of war on Palestinian rights. The international reaction was swift and dramatic. European leaders expressed deep concern about the rapid policy changes and called for emergency European Union meetings. Asian allies requested clarification on security commitments, while adversaries like Iran and North Korea issued statements testing the new administration's resolve. Financial markets reacted nervously to the foreign policy uncertainty. Defense stocks surged on expectations of increased military spending, while international trade stocks declined on fears of renewed trade wars and alliance disruptions. Number 8. Tech and media crackdown. In the final hour of his first day, Trump launched what his administration called the Digital Fairness Initiative, a comprehensive regulatory offensive against big tech companies and mainstream media outlets. At 7 p.m., the Department of Justice was directed to open immediate investigations into alleged political bias and censorship by major social media platforms. This includes Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, with investigators given broad authority to examine internal communications and content moderation decisions. The investigations will focus on alleged suppression of conservative voices, coordination with government officials during the Biden administration, and what Trump called election interference through content moderation. Companies could face billions in fines and potential antitrust action. The second component froze all federal contracts with companies that the administration deemed to have promoted woke policies. This includes major contractors like Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, potentially affecting billions in government cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and consulting contracts. Third, Trump established a special task force to review Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the law that protects social media platforms from liability for user-generated content. The task force has 90 days to recommend changes that would make platforms more accountable for content moderation decisions. Fourth, the Federal Communications Commission was directed to investigate broadcast news networks for potential bias in their coverage of political events. This includes CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, and NBC, with particular focus on their coverage of the 2024 election and Trump's legal challenges. Fifth, the administration announced plans to revoke the press credentials of reporters and news organizations that it deemed to have published deliberately false information about the Trump administration. A new credentialing system would prioritize fair and balanced reporting. The tech industry's response was immediate and alarmed. Several major CEOs called emergency board meetings, while others began exploring legal challenges to the new policies. Stock prices for major tech companies plummeted in after-hours trading. News organizations condemned the moves as attacks on press freedom and the First Amendment. Several major news outlets announced they would continue their coverage unchanged and would fight any attempts to revoke credentials through the courts. Civil liberties organizations called it the gravest threat to free speech in modern American history. The Electronic Frontier Foundation and American Civil Liberties Union announced coordinated legal challenges, while journalist organizations called for industry-wide resistance. The policies also have international implications, as many of the targeted companies operate globally. European regulators announced they would monitor the situation closely and could implement retaliatory measures if American companies face what they consider unfair treatment. The nation reacts. By 8 p.m. on January 20th, 2025, America had been fundamentally transformed. The impact of Trump's first day was being felt from coast to coast, and the nation's reaction was as divided as the policies themselves. In major cities across the country, massive protests erupted within hours of the policy announcements. In New York, over 50,000 people gathered in Times Square. In Los Angeles, protesters blocked major highways. In Chicago, demonstrations outside federal buildings led to dozens of arrests. But the protests were matched by celebrations in other parts of the country. In rural areas and conservative strongholds, Trump supporters held rallies praising the swift action. In Texas, Florida, and other red states, governors announced full cooperation with federal policies and promised to implement even stronger versions at the state level. The legal battlefield was immediate and intense. By midnight on January 20th, over 200 lawsuits had been filed in federal courts across the country. The American Civil Liberties Union, Southern Poverty Law Center, and dozens of other organizations filed emergency injunctions seeking to block implementation of the new policies. State governments split along predictable lines. Blue states like California, New York, Washington, and Illinois announced they would refuse to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, would maintain their own environmental standards, and would provide legal challenges to federal policies. Red states, however, embraced the changes. Florida announced it would implement even stricter immigration policies. Texas began preparing to assist with federal deportation efforts, and several Republican governors called special legislative sessions to align state law with federal policies. Financial markets reacted dramatically to the day's events. The stock market saw wild swings, with energy companies and private prison operators surging, while technology companies and renewable energy firms plummeted. The dollar strengthened against most foreign currencies, but international trade stocks declined on fears of renewed trade wars. Around the world, allies and adversaries alike scrambled to understand the implications of America's dramatic policy shift. NATO called an emergency meeting, European Union leaders expressed deep concern, and several countries began developing contingency plans for reduced American cooperation. Social media platforms were overwhelmed with reactions. Hashtags like Not Start Day One Chaos, The Great Reversal, and SAC America First trended worldwide. The platforms themselves struggled with how to moderate content related to the new policies while facing potential government investigation. As Americans went to bed on January 20th, 2025, they knew they were living in a different country than when they woke up. The policies implemented in a single day would reshape American life for years to come, affecting everything from immigration and climate change to civil rights and international relations. America wasn't just entering a new presidential term. It was entering a completely new era of governance, one that would be defined by the unprecedented scope and speed of change implemented in just 24 hours. Whether you support or oppose these dramatic changes, one thing is absolutely clear. Donald Trump's return to the presidency has already fundamentally reshaped America, and it all happened in just one extraordinary day. The policies we've discussed today will affect millions of Americans in their daily lives. From students and workers to immigrants and business owners, from environmental activists to tech entrepreneurs, everyone will feel the impact of these day-one decisions. Over the coming weeks and months, we'll be following how these policies are implemented, how the legal challenges proceed, and what the long-term consequences will be for American democracy and society. The story of Trump's second presidency is just beginning, and day one may be remembered as the moment that changed everything. What do you think about these dramatic changes? Are you surprised by the scope of day one actions? How do you think these policies will affect your community? Let us know in the comments below. We want to hear your perspective on this historic day. Make sure to like this video if you found our breakdown helpful, subscribe to stay updated on all the latest political developments, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our analysis of what happens next in the Trump 2025 era. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.